Hello everyone, welcome to Winthrop in the World. I'm Paul Baskin. With us today is Galen Mook. Galen is the head of MassBike, the statewide bike advocacy group. Maybe you can tell us a bit, Galen, what that's about and why a group like that matters to a town like Winthrop.
Oh, sure, yeah. So MassBike is known as the Massachusetts Bicycle Coalition. We're a nonprofit 501c3 that's been advocating for better biking, founded in 1977. So we're going on almost 5 full decades. Okay. And we are the only statewide nonprofit, and we work
only statewide nonprofit.
Oh, I'm sorry, that is working on biking on a holistic level in terms of legislation, policies, funding mechanisms, kind of at that strata of a statewide level. But as we know that most biking concerns are local concerns, so one of the reasons why we're important to towns like Winthrop is that the idea of how can we enact policies or funding or legislation that allows you as bike advocates here or transportation mobility advocates to be able to be effective in your local communities.
I see. And you've been doing that for what, 6 years now?
Yeah, I joined MassBike, though MassBike's been around for almost 50 years. I joined in 2018, so we're going on almost 7 years so far with me at the helm.
Right, and you're originally from the DC area, but now you came to Boston because of Boston University?
Yeah, that's right. So I moved here in 2003, before Boston had any bike lanes, for instance, and have been around for almost 21, 22 years, and kind of seen the city of Boston's development, and then by ripple effect, the impacts that better biking and kind of the conversations around safer transit and more active mobility have really taken root, not just in Boston and the greater Boston region, but kind of across the entire state.
Right. So Winthrop doesn't have any bicycle infrastructure really at all. It doesn't have any bike lanes.
Right.
It doesn't have anything, in fact, that even does anything to slow down cars really, other than signs. How is that sort of a normal kind of situation around the Boston area, or is that more of a unique situation?
Well, the certain quirk of Massachusetts, I should say, is that we are very municipally driven. And by that I mean there's 351 cities and towns, and they all have local control over what happens on their roads. So though there may be policies or money that comes from the state that says, hey, you should do a bike lane, it doesn't actually get into place until the town manager or the mayor of a city or the city council actually creates policies that say, no, you must put in a bike lane here, and we're doing it because of this reason. Right. So it really is a kind of a puzzle that I'm piecing together across the state in order to make connectivity a regional conversation. And it is a challenge for my work because, as you can imagine, transportation is a regional conversation. People don't just bike to a town line and then turn around. Right. So the beauty of what we do at MassBike, but also kind of the headwind, is how do we make sure that a town like Winthrop is communicating with the city of Boston so that when you hit Eastie or when you go up to Revere, that there is connectivity and a shared understanding of how our streets are used. And most people who use the roads or sidewalks or pathways don't really realize that it is so piecemeal. Right. And that is kind of why MassBike is so important to exist as an organization.
Right, right. In this town, there are people who, as a matter of fact, quite a few people who don't want to hear this kind of talk. They think that the town is doing just fine with cars only. Why is that not an okay? I mean, why is that not a reasonable way to approach it? If it's working, it's not broken in their minds.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a challenge because the generations that preceded mine kind of had an ethos of developing an environment that is really autocentric, and the ideology that people are going to drive to do everything is baked into our built environment. You can't necessarily build a house unless you have parking accommodations. Right. You can't build a building that has businesses unless you have parking accommodations. And these are structural policy level conversations that have been in play for, I don't know, probably since the 50s. And we're slowly but really kind of more rapidly coming to the realization that we are full. We're not building any more roads. We really can't build any more surface parking without it having some severe detrimental impacts for our environment, for our daily safety, for our pollution. So we actually need to kind of peel back a little bit of the layers of what are the policies that got us into such an autocentric ideology, and what can we do to kind of either add or modify certain policies that will start to allow for other modes to be accepted. And I don't mean to say that like I'm anti-car, and frankly, because I work statewide, I literally have to drive from the Berkshires to the Cape quite a bit. But there's a lot of people in our communities who don't have the ability to drive. Maybe they don't have the affordability of it. Maybe they're disabled and they actually aren't able to get driver's licenses. Maybe they're too old or too young. Or maybe they're just doing it for reasons for health and wellness or for environmental sustainability or for cost effectiveness. And so we need to have the ability, not like necessarily even bike lanes for everyone, but the fact that you mentioned that there aren't even any in Winthrop shows the disparity on how this town has been, and a lot of towns and cities in Massachusetts have actually been only building for auto centrality for so long. And so what we're trying to do is get a seat at the table to say, okay, well, we have the driving. Of course we have the driving. Every road is for driving, but every road should also be for walking, and every road should also be for biking, because honestly, they're public ways. So it should be for people. So trying to get that into the conversation is a challenge, just because the lived experience of most people who have been, residents in Winthrop aren't familiar with it. So the challenge, I feel, is actually somewhat starting from a very base level conversation of what are the needs, what are the demands that would allow for kind of a more openness of other modes on our streets, and then how can we have that conversation in a rational way? And I feel that there's a lot of people who are unaware of the benefits that can come from improved walking, improved biking, and improved transit. And so I think that's kind of where we're starting from in towns like Winthrop right now.
Yeah, so, but I think when you hear some people talk about it, they will agree with some of the things you're talking about, but they look at the roads as they are right now and see, especially getting in and out of Winthrop, there's only 2 ways in and out of Winthrop, that those, especially the main road out through East Boston, can get crowded. And that they look at that situation and think, if you actually added a bike lane there, that would just make it even worse and make it even, is that true in any sense? Or, I mean, is it really the case that enough people would bike that would really reduce that congestion, or what?
Well, if you look at the roads, I mean, they're constrained. One, they're constrained by the number of lanes already, and I don't believe that on Saratoga Street adding a bike lane would actually take away a lane, really, and so it's not a reduction of capacity. So that's the first level of if you're trying to build an argument. The other argument is that by having safe passage through these narrow channels through other modes, you're allowing more people to get through these corridors without requiring them to drive. So if you can encourage people to bike to the Blue Line stations, for instance, without having to drive to the Blue Line stations, that's fewer cars. So therefore, that's a reduction of congestion. And the third is actually, again, it's about equity and about safety, because yes, we are going to still have roads, but we need to make sure that people who, again, don't have the privilege or luxury of being able to have a car still can get in and out of the town just as safe. So regardless of whether or not it might add congestion during the peak hours, which again is still debatable and can be studied and can be discussed with data, it really does come down to who are we welcoming this town for. And I actually think that there are few instances in Massachusetts where Winthrop is particular, because we're kind of a peninsula. Like, there's no through traffic. Nobody's going through Winthrop to go anywhere else. So there is a unique opportunity to do a hard study and say, okay, well, maybe we actually can change the traffic flow so that the people who can get in and out can still get in and out, but we're not concerned about people who are going between 2 different places and going through Winthrop. So,
although I have to say there is some evidence though that there is one situation where people are going through, which is coming down through Revere, cutting through Winthrop, and then getting into the tunnel through East Boston. And so Winthrop does have some of that apparently going on, but
only
again,
on the edge, though. You know what I mean? And once you get into the neighborhoods and get closer to the Deer Island, you really afford the spatial awareness to say, okay, we're only really focusing on people who are already here or needing to come here. So similar to what's happening in Provincetown or some of the other coastal towns, because they realize that, you're right, on the edge, there still needs to have capacity that meets, an increase of demand and growth of population. But in the interior core, Winthrop isn't growing necessarily with people coming in and out. So what can we really do to have more people on foot and on bike, which will actually alleviate some of that traffic congestion?
And what about parking minimums, which still are still a case? Is there an argument for maintaining parking minimums so that people who want to have cars have a way, or parking minimums maybe one of those things that maybe feels important but maybe it is problematic somehow in the long run?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at parking minimums on a larger scale, it does show how policies and the zoning actually are, I hate to put it this way, but are exclusionary to some communities.
Yeah.
And a lot of the parking minimums were designed in order to prohibit density. And the reason for prohibiting density is a multifaceted gem that we can talk about probably in a whole other hour.
Right.
A lot of it is, not to say too much of it, but a lot of it was because of white flight of the kind of the people of means being able to leave the urban core when the cities were starting to decay. And this was back in the 70s and the 80s. And a lot of these zoning policies around parking minimums date back to that.
Yeah.
We're in a different conversation now of what density can bring to a community. And it's not the same as it was back in the 70s and 80s, which arguably were, whether intentional or not, ended up being kind of racist and classist. We are actually seeking density because that does bring more dollars, that does bring more shoppers, that does bring more GDP to a community and more tax base to a community. So we're actually seeing density not as a threat to the stability of towns and cities, but actually as a benefit. So I do think there's a good conversation that can be made on a holistic zoning level of, can density actually be a good benefit to communities when, but again, you're still dealing with people who may have lived here for decades and are still kind of steeped in that old conversations that were happening way back when.
Right.
So it might actually be, I hate to call it like a generational need of a shift, but I think that a lot of the folks who are looking to kind of move new to a place like Winthrop would actually welcome a higher density conversation, which then would require a reduction of parking minimums in order to make development feasible.
Which is another whole question in a town like Winthrop, which is whether people do in fact want to encourage more people to move to the town. There's a lot, but a lot of that gets wrapped up. It sounds like when people talk about the town being too congested, they kind of interplay between congested in terms of people and congested in terms of cars.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of folks I think that they're one and the same.
Yeah, and I think there's a missed opportunity here because you are a pretty transit-rich community. You know, you have buses that come through. I biked here from the Blue Line station. It took me like less than 10 minutes. The idea that you can get to and from Winthrop without needing to do a car for every trip affords you the ability to actually bring more people in, and their money, their dollars, their shopping, their lives, their community build. That means more families, more kids in the school system, more small businesses that might pop up.
Yeah.
But if you're requiring that those people who are coming in have to have the ability to drive, then of course you're only going to increase traffic when you increase population. So we do need to get to the fissure of that meld and say, no, we can bring more people without bringing more traffic if we don't have zoning codes that require more people to then also bring more traffic.
So you're getting me to, I had a list of sort of things that people tend to use as arguments against what you're talking about.
Right. And I should mention that we barely talked about bikes so far, which is kind of, I don't mean to throw shade, but I love the fact that biking isn't really about biking. It really is about so many other different issues.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why a beauty of MassBike can be so effective, because I'm more than happy to help a town and a city figure out zoning, and in its stead, help out biking in the same.
Right. Fair enough. We'll get to, but this is one. So are these, one of these things that you made me think of it is the arguments that people throw out. People can't bike year round, and not everyone can bike, and that's an argument for not having bike lanes and bike infrastructures. Not everybody can bike, and in a town, in the Boston area, people aren't going to do it for several months of the year.
I mean, sure. I mean, the numbers do drop off in winter, and depending on the winter. This past winter was particularly snowy and icy. You know, I'm probably one of the few core who kind of does it for utility. So I've, you know, adapted over the 20 plus years I've lived in Boston. You know, I've got the studded tires, I've got the deep gloves, and I've got like the gear to make sure, and the know-how and the experience to be safe. But I would not necessarily think that this is like a common thing that most people are going to be able to do. And I think that's fine. But the flip side is like, okay, well, that's still only part of the year. I mean, are you going to have are you only going to focus on the negatives and throw the baby out with the bathwater? Right. And I think as a town like Winthrop, this is a perfect community to bike around in for both transportation and recreation. Right. So I'd flip that to the corollary argument of like, well, don't you want to be able to bike to the beach in the summertime then? Yeah. So why would you use winter as an excuse to say then year round it's going to be dangerous always? I would rather say, okay, well, fully understanding that we might not be able to clear every bike lane in the wintertime, that's understandable. But winter clearing of ice is a challenge on sidewalks.
Right.
It's a challenge in parking lots. It's not like we shouldn't have parking lots and sidewalks just because it's challenging in the winter. So there are tough conversations and strategies and funding that need to go into making sure that year-round biking is available.
Right.
But I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a valid argument to say that it should never happen year-round just because we can get a bad winter every so often.
Right. Well, and one of the things in this town, and maybe other towns too, is that the town pays to plow the car roads. It does not do the same thing for sidewalks.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, that gets down to the equity of how we, by policy, really only focused on the behind the windshield importance. And there's so much money that gets wasted on plowing that really could be transferred into, and it may take a while, of course, but to have it be a town responsibility to clear sidewalks, I think would be a revolutionary conversation for allowing people to get around in the wintertime who don't have, again, the ability to have a car.
Yeah, so it's not just bikes, even walking is difficult.
Oh, certainly. It's folks who have mobility challenges, it's older folks who really shouldn't be driving, specifically in the wintertime.
Right.
Like, they should still have the ability to walk to their doctor's office, walk to their pharmacy, walk to the grocery store. And that's, it's a similar argument that can be made for biking.
So another one is that bikes can't, you sort of alluded to, bikes can't, this is another one of these arguments we hear, is bikes can't be used for every trip, and bikes are too slow to go to many places.
Sure, I'm not saying you bike always.
Yeah.
Again, it's about equity. Like, you should be able to, in my opinion, my vision of the world is that whatever your need is for the day, you should be able to drive if you need to, you should be able to walk if you should be able to bike, you should be able to find transit, and you should be encouraged, not prohibited from doing any of the others, but you should be encouraged to be able to take other modes so that it frees up the road space for those who actually need it for that actual trip. So, the idea that driving should be just as affordable and safe and convenient as all the other modes, but really, if you're looking at the way Winthrop has been built, it is not as convenient to bike or safe to bike or accessible to bike as it is to on all other levels. So we're just trying to get to a level of parity or even start the conversation that could eventually get us to parity, because again, you're starting from scratch here.
Yeah. Another one that people will say is that the roads were built for cars, and that cyclists don't pay for them, car drivers pay
Unfortunately,
for them.
the roads are built for people. Let's keep that in mind. You are not a car. The car allows you to do things. Yes, it almost is a requirement to do a lot of things, and that, again, that's what we're trying to get across. But arguably, Paul, streets are for people, and you pay taxes, and there's the gas tax that is specific to cars, because obviously cars do the most damage. They require the most amount of infrastructure. A bike lane is very small. A bike path is a fraction of the expense. So it does make sense that those who have the biggest need and have the biggest damage and have the biggest danger should still have the onus of responsibility. But to be honest, general taxes that come from everybody, if I don't own a car, if you don't own a car and you live in Winthrop, your municipal taxes are still going towards plowing, are still going towards restriping, are still going towards repaving the potholes, even if you don't necessarily use them directly in the benefit. But we live in a shared society here. If you don't have children, don't you feel like your taxes should still go to good schools?
Yeah, well, that's a debate in this town for sure.
It's unfortunate then. I think we do need to get to an ideology that we are supporting each other. I mean, Winthrop should be welcoming for everybody. And anybody who disagrees with that really does need to have a hard look in the mirror and say, well, who are you going to state to exclude? And unfortunately, it is true that there is a bit of backlash where people will say, no, let's exclude bikers. And that doesn't, to me, that doesn't make sense, because we're talking about like kids riding to school. We're talking about grandparents riding to the ice cream store. Not necessarily people like me who have the wherewithal to ride in traffic, but we really do need to work on building an environment that is safe for those who need the most amount of comfort and the least amount of stress in order to go about their daily life.
So one of the things, in fact, one of the town leaders said that they don't like the kind of thing you're talking about because they don't want roads to be a place for kids to play, for people to play, that that cars are more serious, apparently.
Again, that needs a hard look in the mirror. Because you are saying to the exclusion of your neighbors. And that, to me, is I just can't accept that argument. I'm sorry.
So one more, though, just on this list is cyclists. This, again, the arguments that we hear: cyclists regularly break the law. They're self-centered. They behave poorly on the roads. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, and let's throw on the table. Like, I also am dismayed at the behavior of people who are out on our streets. People who are biking, for sure. People who are driving, for sure, as well. I mean, let's be honest, it is not just a single mode who is out there skirting the rules and regulations around traffic. The reality is that, as you know, and we discussed, the streets are not designed in an engineering way in order to make it convenient for people who are biking. And to be honest, there is little to no accommodations for how somebody might use a bike to get through an intersection or get around a route. So people who are biking and are familiar with biking have the lived experience of needing to be on the edges and be on the fringes of operating in a street that was never designed for them in the first place. And
so they're forced, in a sense, what you're saying is they're forced to sort of be a little bit kamikaze or something.
Well,
that's not the word you'd use, but something like
they're
that.
They're forced to not trust the engineering to make their route as safe as possible. And there are examples when we have built for all modes. For instance, if you look at the city of Boston, there are a few corridors that are very heavily trafficked. I'm thinking of Commonwealth Avenue.
Trafficked by cars, you mean?
Everybody.
By everybody.
Traffic by bikes, traffic by cars, traffic by buses, traffic by the Green Line, traffic by events. And one of the best examples I like to point out is in Boston University. From the BU Bridge up to Packard's Corner. It's kind of the west campus area of BU. It's one of the most densely populated, narrow-channeled corridors. It's a major arterial. It's a state road. And it's right in the heart of BU's campus. There's thousands upon thousands of students who change classes, every hour, for instance. And what they were able to do was build a real engineered separation between the different modes that every mode feels like they all have their own comfortable level of space. And with that, they've also timed the light cycles. They've built in added bus stops on the outside of the bike lane, so people who are waiting for the bus don't necessarily need to cut through the bike traffic, for instance. They made these big refuge islands for the masses of pedestrians who are crossing, and they maintained the 2 lanes for traffic, turning lanes, and parking. And there's a Green Line trolley that goes right down the center of the median. With that, I just would welcome anybody who wants to do a site visit. Call me up. I'm happy to accompany if it helps.
Okay, we can put that information up on the screen.
For sure, yeah. But like, watch the cyclists as they hit red lights. They will queue up, and they will not run the red lights. Some will. Yeah, some will. But they won't run them at the same rate as you would in an intersection that has none of these treatments, right? Because the cyclists understand that that red light, which is specific to the bikers, is timed, is engineered for their, not just their own throughway, but also their safety. And I think the idea that if you're a biker and you come to an intersection, you look around, you see multiple lanes of traffic that are just built for cars. The stoplights that is timed just for cars, and the walk signal that's timed just for people on foot. There are not these specifications that are a signal for me when I'm on a bike that say, oh, as a biker, I should do this. So therefore, bikers say, okay, well, what gets me through this in one, the most convenient, but also the safest way? Sometimes it is actually, and I really hate to be able to make this argument, it is safer for cyclists to jump red lights and get out of traffic rather than waiting for a green and then having them go next to large vehicles, next to a queue of traffic when they're more wobbly, when they're less stable, when they're shifting gears and just getting going and getting momentum, which is why certain things like lead pedestrian intervals are sometimes held at lights where the pedestrians go out first before the green light happens. It's a way to kind of tame the drivers. So, I hate to get wonky, and my apologies if this is getting too much in the weeds here, but I think my be-all, end-all for an answer to that is once you start designing our roads for the lived experience and needs of people on bikes will follow the rules. But we don't have that, and we might be decades away from getting to that. So that's the first one. The other one, which is maybe a little bit more immediate, is we need education.
And that's one of the things your group does.
Totally, right? Yeah, so MassBike is a leader in statewide education in terms of not just drivers and bikers, but kind of everybody out there as we share the roads. But if you look at the Winthrop school system, I guarantee you there's maybe one lesson that a student might do in their 12 years that talks about biking and walking. It's not ingrained in how we're understanding how we operate in our streets. And I think if we are actually, and again, this is a big ask, but if we're actually able to have this be part of the curriculum in our school system, in the messaging that's coming in driver's ed, and kind of the reminders that go out to drivers when you get your license renewal. There is a lot changing on our roadways right now, and we're not meeting that change with instructing people on how to think about and operate these streets. So there's so much confusion out there. And that's like an also big nut to crack, but I feel it's something that we could crack in the immediate, because we could get curriculum in the schools almost immediately and really start to change that conversation.
Does MassBike have some kind of model curriculum that it's trying to get going?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So we work with the Safe Routes to Schools program. It's a statewide program that comes out of Mass DOT, and we are with certified instructors out in the school systems around the state. We hosted over 250 classes last year. We reached over 2,300 students. It is hugely impactful. However, we're a small nonprofit organization. We're just scratching the surface of the needs. I brought some examples, for instance, for your audience here. We have what's called the Quick Guide.
We can give a link to that.
Yeah, this is just an example. Great. And this is working with the League of American Bicyclists. They're the nationwide advocacy organization. And it goes through things like, having lights on at night. Very basic stuff that you think it would be intuitive, but a lot of cyclists actually don't know that both it's the law and just practical safety. Little things like how to signal, how to use your hand signals. I bet you most cyclists don't have any idea that, oh, maybe if I go like this, that's a signal to drivers that I want to turn left. So little things like that we, again, we're at the very most basic of a lot of these conversations, but we are here at MassBike to help kind of steer both the policies and the funding and the structure, but also provide the resources to make it possible and feasible to get to the future that we want.
If you were a parent in this town, do you think you'd feel safe letting your child ride a bike around freely around town?
I know Winthrop pretty well, actually. I have some friends who are here. I've been here for a couple of Bike Winthrop community rides, Halloween events. One of my favorite routes, actually, is going down and going from the marsh and then going from there to Deer Island and doing the loop around Deer Island. I feel traffic is pretty calm. And for the most part, if you do so slowly, you are able to legally ride on the sidewalk if you're not on an e-bike and you're not like in that little downtown core, which is only about a 3-block. So if you are feeling a little stressed riding on the sidewalk, especially as a child, no problem there. I do think so. I think it's actually more dangerous to drive, frankly, hands down, than any other mode. So if we're encouraging kids to get around town, which you should, you're not just going to be trapped indoors, right? We should encourage kids to get around safely. But again, there has to be education accompanying it. So if I were a parent living in the town, I would actually go through the rigmarole of maybe riding places with my kid, showing them tips and tricks, making sure that they're looking and watching out for drivers and kind of going through the dangers, like drivers might not be paying attention because they might be distracted and on their phones, or there might be blind spots on large vehicles. So there is a kind of a point-by-point checklist that is a parent I would want to make sure was clearly communicated and understood. But yeah, I would not at all want to say, don't go around your town. This is your community.
All right, and we have maybe a minute or two, but I just want to, is there anything in the State House, in the State Capitol, that you're pushing for or pushing against, or something I realize it could be a long list of things, what's on your agenda?
This is great. So I'll put this here. So one of our most recent successes, and I'll put this up here, is that we were able to get in state law what's known as the Vulnerable User Law, which is a designation of people on our roads who are not driving. They're walking, biking, repairing a car, maybe they're on horseback or in farm equipment. And all vulnerable users now have the protection of 4 feet of passing that motorists must give. This is a foundational law that just got into play about 2 years ago. We're still getting, this is a bumper sticker, so if you want a bumper sticker, we will gladly mail these to you at no cost. This is an education campaign going out to drivers right now to say, hey, drivers need to pass with 4 feet of space, which prior to this law being passed, that was not true in Massachusetts. So this is one of the.
It was 3 feet before.
Wasn't even that. It was called safe passing. And safe passing didn't designate safe for whom, or what the minimum was.
Got it.
So now we're 4 feet, and it's not just for about people on bikes. It's about anybody on our roadways. That's the big one. The other one that we were able to do was to designate electric bicycles as their own class of vehicle, so that there can be rules and regulations specific to e-bikes. Because we know that e-bikes are being ridden out there, and there wasn't real clarity as to where or how. So that's another foundational And again, what MassBike does is try to build a structure of legislation or policies or funding that then can be implemented locally. So then it comes down to the town of Winthrop to say, okay, now that we know what e-bikes are, can we design pathways for e-bikes? Or maybe we say e-bikes have to only go 12 miles an hour or something like that, that now the town has the ability to do.
Yeah.
A couple things that we have going in this session. We're working on trying to assign climate goals to our transportation plans so that we're actually encouraging mode shift in terms of we need better transit, we need better walking, we need better biking to get people to drive less or have fewer vehicle miles traveled for climate purposes, because we actually need to meet our climate goals. That's the big one there. And then we're actually seeking a kind of a redesignation of what vulnerability means in terms of crossings. Right now, when you hit a crosswalk, you have to be walking in order to have a protection of a crosswalk. We are hoping to extend that to all vulnerable users. So if you're in a wheelchair, if you're on a scooter or something along those lines, you are still just as vulnerable when you're crossing at a zebra crossing. Right now, we want to kind of get away from a crosswalk and actually make that protection for all vulnerable users. So again, it's not just about biking. But
so all vulnerable users anywhere on the road, or just within a walk?
Well, within the crosswalk.
Got it, within the crosswalk.
Yeah, redesignate that as a marked crossing.
Got it.
But I will say that a lot of the issues that we bring up and up-level to the State House start locally. So what I'm curious is what's going on in Winthrop. And what I want to encourage your viewers to do is keep in touch with MassBike. We have a lot of encouragement activities coming up with Bike Month. We are always around to check in with your reps. You have very powerful and strong reps in the State House that want to make sure that the local levels can actually impact, everybody across the state. So this is a conversation that is constantly evolving. We are both at the State House and at the local level. So my ask actually is, as the legislative session develops, what is happening locally that we can keep an eye on? Whether it's a funding thing we need more money for slowing down traffic and restriping lanes. We need better connectivity to transit. We need to connect the trails into the town. A lot of that stuff can be influenced at the State House, but they'll be impacted here. So that's kind of where my ask is. I don't want to come down and say, this is what we're going to do to your town. I'd rather have that conversation go the other direction.
Sure. Well, Galen Mook, head of MassBike, thank you very much for the time today.
My pleasure, Paul. It was a great conversation, and I'm welcome to continue it. If anybody wants to check out, we are at massbike.org. And we partner with a lot of the local orgs and a lot of the regional orgs too. So help us be a part of the coalition by adding your voices to what we can help elevate and amplify.
Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Paul.